In November of 1977, a young woman was raped and murdered with little clues of who took her life. Only 2 months later, in January of 1978, another young woman was also raped and murdered with many similarities to have detectives state that they were looking for one perpetrator. These two cases went cold and were not solved until 40 years later with science. Once learning who the killer was, we see a past of terrible acts of violence that throw up many red flags. Did the system fail these two women? This is something that we will discuss in this episode of California True Crime, the life of Arthur Rudy Martinez. Hello and welcome to this episode of California True Crime. I'm Sean and I will be hosting this episode tonight. I'm glad to be back as I had to tend to some things last episode. With me tonight are Jessica and Charles. How are you two?
Doing good.
Excellent.
Great. So when I was trying to find a new case this last time, I kind of just started from scratch and type in something in a Google search to see what would come up. The case that we're going to talk about tonight came up, and I felt it really had some similarities to some of the cases we've been discussing of late. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to dive deeper into those topics. When I did dive in, I found a lot of things that raised questions in my own head. And as we go along in the story, I want to hear your opinions of these topics. There were many papers that I used this time, but the main ones that were the Tribune out of San Luis Obispo and the Fresno Bee. This case will actually be covered in two different states, but for the most part, we'll be starting in California in the Atascadero area. For myself personally, having the background of the area that we will be talking about really helps with the setting, the scene, so I can understand it better. So, Jessica, would you please tell us a little bit about Atascadero?
Sure. Atascadero is in San Luis Obispo County. That's about halfway between San Francisco and LA. And we've actually talked about that county before in the episode of Marina Ruggiero. And then also a really famous true crime case is the case of Clifton Smart, which happened in San Luis Obispo County. Atascadero is in that same county. And according to a San Luis Obispo local online paper that kind of gives you ideas of things to do in the area and where to go, it's, quote, known for its laid-back vibe and exuberant community spirit, which I thought was kind of cool. I guess it's really big into the craft beer scene, and then there's wineries out there. So there's a lot of stuff to do. There's a lot of agriculture. It's a really small town, at least especially compared to some of the places that we've talked about, especially recently in Orange County. Now it has a population of about 29,000 or so, but in 1980, it had just a population of 16,000. So a little less than that during the time of the crime that Sean is going to talk about. And it was only incorporated as a town since 1979. So I think when Sean is talking about the murder that he's going to detail, we're talking about sheriffs, not necessarily police. And one of the big employers in the area is Atascadero State Hospital. It employs 2,140 staff, and over 40% of that staff resides inside Atascadero. So it's a huge state hospital, and it gives jobs to a lot of people in the area. So it'd be really common for people to work there, or someone you know might work there. And as far as famous stuff, the movie My Blue Heaven was partially filmed there.
I love that movie.
Yeah, I love My Blue Heaven also.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies too. And there's a famous building there. It's called the Atascadero City Hall. It's one of the original buildings. It looks really, really beautiful. You can take tours of it. Has a really cool history. So if you're ever in that area, go and see it.
At 2:30 p.m. on Friday, November 18th, 1977, Jane Caroline Antunes, 30 years old, was found in her father's car, a 1972 gold Datsun, with her throat cut. She was on her back in the back seat, partially nude, and the car was on a dirt road by the intersection of Highway 101 and Santa Barbara Road at the southern part of Atascadero. Her brother, David Morton, had found the body when he went looking for her that Friday. She had left Thursday evening from her house to go visit a friend. She never made it to her friend's house. A witness had seen the car there the same day of Friday at 8 a.m., over 6 hours before being discovered. In this first account, Assistant DA Christopher G. Money did say sexual assault was being considered. Quote, "When you have a female who is murdered like that, there's always a possibility of sexual assault." No weapon was found at the scene, but there was some fresh dents on the car. No evidence that there was another car at the scene, leading detectives to believe the perpetrator left on foot. Jane's mother also said that Jane was, quote, "terrified of hitchhikers, has a horror of rape, and would not have picked up anybody." After about 10 days, it did come out that she was, quote, sexually attacked. It also came out in this article that her hands had been bound behind her back. After an autopsy, it was most likely that she had been murdered in between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. Thursday evening going on to Friday morning. The sheriffs did receive calls with tips continuously for approximately 3 weeks of the murder, but really led nowhere. A little bit about Jane. Jane lived with her parents in El Camino Real, which seemed to be a little suburb of Atascadero. Mom said she was very popular and very liked in a large circle of friends. At the time, she had been dating an Atascadero construction worker who they were both planning on getting married. She attended Atascadero High School and graduated in 1965, which she then went to Cuesta College. The same year that Jane graduated from high school, she lost her sister Barbara in a car accident, and Barbara was only the age of 16 at the time. Jane had a job at the time, but quit and stayed home to help her parents out. Since her mom had a heart condition and was pretty ill, she had bypass surgery. She lived with her parents for about 11 years after being divorced, and she had a 13-year-old daughter who lived with her father in Portland, Oregon. This is a new occurrence. She did live with Jane, but because of her mom's declining health, she went up there to live with her father in Portland for a while. Now, on December 9th, 1977, sheriff's detectives mailed out 250 flyers to residents in the Atascadero area where Jane was living with her parents. It's interesting in this certain article that Sheriff George S. Whiting, quote, likened the investigation to the case of the so-called Hillside Strangler in Los Angeles, where investigators had been unable to come up with a suspect in the killing of 10 women. You know, this is all happening in the same time, and we've talked about late 70s and how it just seems like there's a lot going on with all these cases. They also, at the time, are using a composite picture of a man who was seen on the freeway, most likely hitchhiking. The article did not have this composite. It said the composite is, quote, extremely vague, and even if they located him, could not be called a suspect. So we've talked about composites before, and some of them are just so rough, you know, like this probably sounds like it.
Do you know, is this composite drawn from witnesses who saw the victim with the possible hitchhiker, or just saw someone maybe hitchhiking in the area?
I think it's more my assumption that it was witnesses around the time who just saw a hitchhiker. I don't think anyone saw anyone with Jane. Jane's mom also started a fund for Jane's daughter for her future education. I'm guessing it's for a college fund, but it didn't say. Now, on January 11th, almost 2 months after the murder of Jane, the nude body of Patricia Dwyer, who was 28 years old, was found on the living room floor of the home that she rented. She was found in her home in Atascadero by a friend who went to visit her at 3:45 p.m. in the afternoon. Besides being nude, Patricia had been stabbed once in the chest above the left breast. Right away in this article, one day after the murder, investigators are already trying to link both Patricia and Jane. Quote, we'd like to find some similarities because it would give us another avenue to work on. Sheriff Whiting would go on to say that the similarities, quote, were both single women, nude, knifed, left over a period of time. Patricia had worked at the Atascadero State Hospital, which we talked about earlier, for about 2 years by this time. More information came out the next day from the sheriff, who said that Patricia was raped and killed by a man she knew because there was no forced entry. She was last seen alive at 5:30 p.m. Tuesday, January 10th, 1977. So, in this article that came out Friday, 2 days after the body was discovered, they talked about some more similarities or rough connections. Jeffrey Morton, who we mentioned before was Jane's brother, worked at Atascadero State Hospital with Patricia Dwyer and knew her. He also knew some other people who knew both the victims. So pretty much with only 1 week going by, Sheriff Whiting said, quote, "I feel the people of this county, particularly the Atascadero area, have a right to know there's probably only one kook running around out there, not two." This was all based on the similarities that I already mentioned, plus a couple more that they add in the article, that both women had been seen at the Tally Ho Tavern in Atascadero on several occasions. I don't think it was them together, but it was a bar that they went to separately. It also mentioned that Patricia's hands were bound behind her back like Jane, but she was able to break her restraints at one point. They got a kind of more really obvious details like the same age and that they were both white. So, do you think these similarities give reason to believe that they're connected? We've talked about, like, in the last couple episodes, the Jane Stallcup case where there was a lot of similarities and it wasn't together. Do you see that these similarities are more airtight to say it's one person?
I could see why the police would. Like you said, they're both female, both around the same age, hands bound, stabbed. So there are, but also, the idea that they're both from the same small town, while on the surface could be a similarity, it's also the fact that it's just a small town. Relatively small, and with around 20,000 people, you're bound to run in the same circles. So I don't know. It's a tough one. I can see if I was a police officer that I would probably line up all of the evidence and look at it and try to make connections.
I think it makes sense. I mean, just by nature of Patricia Dwyer working at Atascadero State Hospital, she's going to know a lot of people in town or be affiliated with them because there's so many people that work there. But the crime themselves are so unusual for a small area like this. Not that they can't happen, but it is unusual. And then it's happened to two people. And with the hand binding and that they're both motivated by sexual assault, I really think that it makes sense to, you don't have to throw out every other avenue to look at, but to definitely consider that possibility. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, to me also, that it was 2 months apart in a small town. I think that 2 months might seem like a long time, but it's really not when it's very similar murders. But yeah, some of the things seemed a little far-fetched for me, but some of them didn't.
Well, and two, I think that's hindsight. We know these are connected, but
right,
probably at the time, like you said, the time frame. And, it seems like at the time, too, even though we've talked a lot about the 1970s being, it seems like there was another violent crime every other week in the papers, or, big time crimes. It seems like Atascadero probably would not have that many of these type of crimes. So that in itself.
Close to 3 weeks later, a 32-year-old married man with 2 kids was questioned at length for the murder of both women. The man knew both women and used to work at the same state hospital as Patricia. He was questioned for over 30 hours straight because he agreed to a lie detector test and, quote, did not do well on the test. There were even talks in the paper that the man might take sodium pentothal, better known as truth serum. After the 30 hours, the man was cleared and not a suspect anymore. This led to somewhat backtracking and going back to other leads, while I think they were somehow really set on this guy, kind of tunnel vision, and they were just set on him for like a week, and so they had to go back.
The sodium pentothal is interesting too. It's such a 1970s and 80s thing. at least, and we always kind of talk about, what the tropes that are created in movies, but I mean, how many movies in the 70s and 80s had somebody using sodium pentothal to get somebody to tell the truth about stuff? It's weird to me to see that would be even on somebody's radar in real life.
Right. I mean, I kind of put it up there with psychics.
Well, even lie detector tests, I mean, how many times have we talked about the inadmissibility of lie detectors, but it's not detecting whether you're lying, it's detecting whether your body has responses to stress, which anybody being hooked up to a machine and being interrogated by the police is going to be stressful. So, it's another instance of again, police doing everything that they can to try to gather information and evidence and leaving no stone unturned, again, with the benefit of hindsight, knowing that some of this stuff is probably not beneficial or useful or worthwhile. But,
right.
I imagine at the time you got to take every bit of help you can.
The Tally Ho Tavern in Atascadero that I mentioned earlier as a place where both women were seen occasionally put up a $200 reward by the owner and the patrons. On Friday, January 27th, 8 to 10 officers raided the Tally Ho Tavern. This is the day that they announced that the man that they had been questioning for 30 hours was not a suspect anymore. And this evening, they raided this tavern. They came in shining flashlights into the band members' faces that were playing and demanded them to stop. They were checking IDs and sobriety. The owner, Ken Carner, called this, quote, Gestapo tactics. He also said, the tactics they use, I thought they died with Hitler. 3 people were arrested for being drunk in public. So since this happened right after, like the owner of the bar was saying that there's a lot of bikers that frequent there and thought that they came in just kind of, the cops were being a little pushy with how they did things. And what do you think? Do you think this was too much here, what the police officers did?
I don't know. I've been in bars before where the police have come in and done like spot raids of, like checking everybody's IDs and, I'm not pushy, but, also not too, sometimes maybe not the most civil. I think in this case too, like we've talked about, you have two murders that close together. You may not necessarily have any leads, or the one lead you thought you had might have disintegrated. So I can see that public pressure would be on for them to solve this. And then the only other connection is, the main tavern in town.
Right.
And that being a likely spot where they could have met their killer.
Exactly.
I guess it's kind of hard to, if you're on the other side getting pushed around by.
I think it's interesting that 3 people were actually arrested for drunk in public. Like, you're in a bar. I didn't know that happens.
Yeah. If you're over the limit, or you're, I can see somebody in, like I said, have been in situations where somebody was probably belligerent in a bar and was asked to leave, and then cops had to escort him out.
Right, but this is more of how I see it is they came in unannounced to someone having fun. No one asked the person to leave, and then they get arrested.
Right.
It's hard to know exactly without knowing what they were thinking, because I could see, like you're saying, Charles, you're out of leads, and these are obviously 2 very serious cases. The 70s are scary. You don't know what's going to happen next. You don't want to wait until someone else has been murdered. So maybe you're going in like that to try and scare a witness to come forward. On the other hand, this is a place where you think these women might have been, maybe where they met their murderer. Mm-hmm. You need these people to trust you, to be able to talk to you.
Yeah.
And so it could have the opposite effect, but without knowing their intent.
Yeah, I can understand that too. You're wanting people to trust you and to come forward and share the information. It seems like in this case, maybe the velvet glove might have worked better than the iron fist. But again, I think without knowing the situation or the intent of the police officers, that's a hard judgment to make.
After this, it feels like the case went pretty cold. The next newspaper article I could find wasn't for 9 more months. And in this article, Sheriff Whiting says that the case is still open. There's just not a lot of new info. They have multiple suspects, and all but one had been cleared. Detective Sergeant John Hasty, who was working on the cases, said, quote, "That does not mean that the suspect who has not been cleared as guilty. It just means we have been unable to clear him through investigation.
That's a kind of a tough quote. I'm just thinking from our perspective, living in a town that's roughly the same size, and this quote's in the newspaper. I mean, for sure, even if it doesn't name the person, everyone in town knows who they brought into question.
Yeah, small town gossip. People that story's gonna spread.
Yeah, and I could never find any information who this person was. So this was pretty much it for these cold cases that stay cold until it was announced in April of 2019 that they had linked the same man to both these cases. His name was Arthur Rudy Martinez, and before we learn about the solving of the cases, let's go back and learn all about this terrible man. We've talked about a life of crime before, but this Martinez guy really had one. The first thing I could find was in November of 1964 from the Selma Enterprise. Selma is a small town on the outskirts of Fresno in Central California. To put in perspective, Fresno to Atascadero is a little over a 2-hour drive. When Martinez was 16, he and 2 other youths burglarized Selma Poultry, Selma Surplus, and the Toggery, which was another business in Selma. They also stole a woman's car that day in front of a store she worked at. He was arrested and placed in juvenile hall. So in these 3 robberies, it was an extremely detailed newspaper article. They stole 4 packs of cigarettes, 20 cigars, a rifle, binoculars, 3 hunting knives, and clothes in their sizes. Also, after stealing the car, which was in the afternoon, they drove to Fresno, saw a movie, drove back, and abandoned the car. The way that they got caught was going to a high school football game wearing the clothes that they had just stole. All in all, they're 16, which even at 16, these crimes seem pretty crazy, but there was no violence at all in them.
So you're saying they didn't cause any physical violence against another human being.
Right. Yeah, I guess they stole a car and stuff like that, and broke in places, but it wasn't physical harm to any humans at this. Then over a year later, we had another story in December of 1965 where Martinez is being arrested for burglary again, but this time seemed a little more heightened. This time Martinez and 2 different people robbed a liquor store, but they used a sawed-off .22 caliber rifle. They were caught very quickly in a car that witnesses gave a description of. In the car was the rifle plus the $205 that they had stole. Martinez had admitted that he was the one holding the gun. This robbery was in Fresno, and they drove around casing liquor stores to rob before picking the one that they did. So it was a premeditated and armed robbery. So this is escalating, and you can, it's not physical harm, but it's definitely, if you're pointing a gun at someone, that is some harm that can be done.
Yeah, the threat is there.
Right. Now, 18 months later, things drastically change, and Martinez is arrested again in June of 1967. From the story, Martinez, who is now 18 years old, entered a store in Fresno with the intention of robbing it. Apparently, he didn't know anyone was in the store, and he overpowered the 48-year-old woman who worked there. He tied her hands up, raped her, and then shot her in the forehead. Quote, the bullet striking her in the forehead, going under her scalp and emerging at the top of her head. Someone gave a description of the pickup truck he was driving, and they saw it in the parking lot of Cedar Lanes in Fresno, which was a bowling alley, and it permanently closed in May of 2012. He was at the restaurant in the bowling alley. As of 8 days later, from other articles, it says that the woman was in satisfactory condition. So she didn't die. In this article, it also says that in September of 1964, he was apprehended twice on runaway charges and remanded by police. The first documented crime that I found in the paper for those robberies and the clothes and everything was from November of 64. So it was a month. The robberies were after a month of these runaways. So I don't know what the runaway charges were for. At his arraignment, he was also being charged for other crimes. One of them only happened one day before he raped and tried to murder the woman from Fresno. He was being charged with 3 other counts of attempted murder, which it looks like he was just doing random shootings. Quote, "The other shootings occurred when a 16-year-old girl reported a bullet zipped through her hair as she stood waiting for a bus, and a 26-year-old housewife was shot in the right hip on May 29th outside her home in the 3300 block of East Nevada Avenue." As of September of 1967, Martinez pled guilty to all the charges. In the Tribune, it says that sentencing guidelines at the time had 1 to 50 years for rape and 1 to 14 years for attempted murder. He only ended up serving 10 years and was paroled in May of 1977. What do you think about this huge leniency with these maybe 1-year sentencings? Like, that just seemed crazy to me, looking at 1 to 5 years, 1 to 50 years for rape and 1 to 14 for attempted murder, and he only served 10.
Well, it's in California before 1977, there really is no mandatory sentencing laws. We don't really get kind of the dawn of the new mandatory sentencing laws until right around 1977. Before that time, judges had a lot of leeway, dependent on, the age, whether it was violence, whether it was a gun involved, and so on, for how you really sentenced a criminal. After 77, with the advent of the mandatory sentencing laws, there still is some leeway, but there are like mandatory ceilings and mandatory floors for how much you would give somebody. Then you would tack on like we've talked about before, like gang enhancements, hate crime enhancements, if there was a use of a gun. But before that time, that huge leeway really is, like I said, up to the judge.
It's hard because A, we know what this man goes on to do, and then B, these are already really terrible crimes.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I know mandatory sentences have been cause for a lot of people who've been stuck in jail for a very long time, judges not being able to take into account mitigating circumstances, putting people of color in jail far longer than other people. So I know there's very real issues with mandatory sentencing. It's just frustrating here. And this is just one case I have to keep trying to tell myself that out of lots of others who don't end like this one's going to. But it is frustrating to see him spend so little time in jail for some very terrible crimes.
Well, I also think it's too sometimes how it's reported. Like in some of these articles where it's saying that he is eligible for between 1 and 50 years, after having read an article where it's that he did terrible things to his victims. That is a bitter pill to swallow.
If you like weird and strange history, then I have the podcast for you. My name is Brenda, and I'm the host of Horrifying History. Are you into the dark side of history? Horrifying History tells you about the side of history that people don't normally talk about. We talk about the tales of haunted places, infamous true crimes, cursed items, and unsolved mysteries, and then we look into the science and documentation to see where does the truth actually lie. Want to get spooky with us? Get your Horrifying History fix by subscribing to Horrifying History, which you can find on any major podcast provider.
So after the release in May of 1977, less than 6 months after that, this is when he raped and killed both Jane and Patricia. He also gets married on November 10th, only weeks before he kills Jane. Very shortly after killing Patricia, Martinez heads up to Washington State into Spokane. I don't know if it was because he was scared or it had something to do with his wife, like she had family there. I don't even know if his wife went with him, but he left. Pretty sure he was probably not supposed to with parole and everything, but he finds himself there. Starting in May of 1978 and going until September of the same year, Martinez was on a pretty intense crime spree. So the police think that he kills Patricia in January, heads straight up to Washington, and this is less than 6 months later, and he's on this new crime spree. When he was arrested for this, the court charged him with 15 charges, 9 counts of armed robberies, 4 attempted armed robberies, and 2 counts of first-degree rape. The places that he robbed were grocery stores, convenience stores, fast food places, service stations, and restaurants. When he robbed one of the restaurants, this is where he sexually assaulted 2 women, which got him the first-degree rape charges. After pleading not guilty at first, he went on to plead guilty, which some of the charges were dropped, but he was still given 6 concurrent terms of life imprisonment. He would not be up for parole for about 13 years and 4 months, the paper said. The judge who sentenced him said of Martinez as, quote, vicious almost to the point of an animal and a danger to society in the extreme. Martinez went to Walla Walla State Penitentiary. In May of 1991, so quite a time after he's already in the state penitentiary, I found that he was still married and his wife filed for divorce out of Polk County in Oregon. She was granted the divorce in September of that same year.
But they were married from when he went in 78 to 91?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. It doesn't mean that they were ever, that she visited him or anything. She might have, who knows, like found someone else and thought, let's just get a divorce so I can marry this new person finally, or...
Oh, yeah, but that's just a long
time.
Yeah.
It was a long time. During his stay at Walla Walla State Penitentiary, it was said that he had, quote, absolutely no problems, infractions, or confrontations with other inmates. Because of his good behavior for his time there since 1978, he was moved to minimum security and was rewarded to work on the prison dairy and hog farm starting in 1990. At 2:30 p.m. on May 29th, 1994, guards reported Martinez, who was 56 years old at the time, missing from the farm. He apparently walked off during a break and never came back. So the odd thing that the paper kept talking about is why he did it, because he was supposedly almost done with his sentence with only 6 more months to go. Quote, Arthur Rudy Martinez was scheduled for release November 21st after serving 16 years for multiple robbery and rape convictions in Spokane. It doesn't explain why he was going to be released. I know that it was 13 years and 4 months. It could be that, his parole actually was up. Who knows? But I feel like I've heard in many situations of these minimum security places where people just walk off. Do you feel that even though he was such a model prisoner, that with his past, he should have had minimum security?
Yeah, I don't know. Never having been in that situation, it's a hard one. But if he hadn't, I can see why they would have moved him. If he hadn't given the guards any problems, he'd been a model prisoner. For all intents and purposes, even though he was a terrible person, he's paying his debt to society. He's not, he hadn't committed any other violent acts in prison. Free up that space for somebody else that might be somebody who, is a worse prisoner.
So after he escapes, the Tribune says that he went back to Fresno, where he lived there under an alias for 20 years. After 20 years, in 2014, Martinez turned himself into the police. It doesn't seem like it was because of change of heart or anything. He had cancer, and he turned himself in only to receive cancer treatment in prison, where he died shortly after. Now, it wasn't until 5 years after he had already died that closure came to be for the family and friends of Jane Antonez and Patricia Dwyer. So how the closures of these cases came about was familial DNA, but a tiny bit different from how we had been talking about it lately. Back in 1977, DNA was not a thing, but we have discussed that investigations still collected many things back then. One thing was semen, because in previous episodes we've talked about how they could use semen as a way to figure out a blood type. So the investigators and the cold case unit did an excellent job in collecting and preserving evidence, such as the semen that was collected at both sites. After getting a DNA profile in 2005, detectives entered it into CODIS. Nothing ever came up as a hit through the years, which led detectives to think that the suspect had already died or wasn't arrested in California after 2009 when, quote, DNA became mandatory for anyone arrested on suspicion of a felony offense. In February of 2018, the California Department of Justice Familial DNA Search Team did a familial search and found a match. It was a relative of Martinez who, quote, was in the system because he had been arrested for an unrelated felony. What do you guys think? When I was reading all this, what do you guys think about this whole giving up your DNA when you are arrested for a felony, even though you were not convicted yet? The quotes here, how it says, DNA became mandatory for anyone arrested on suspicion of a felony offense, and the Martinez relative was in the system because he had been arrested for an unrelated felony. Neither of those things say convicted. And I feel like, for myself, reading these things, anyone could say, I think, like, you get pulled over, you look like a guy who just robbed this place. This is a suspicion of a felony. I'm going to take your DNA without you giving permission. What do you think about it?
I can understand why this law exists, and I can understand the importance of solving all of these crimes. We've covered many cold cases and talked a lot about the need for families to have some sort of closure, if that even exists, but finding that truth. But I think there is something that bothers me about taking DNA from everyone who goes to a police station, ultimately, and you don't have to prove that they've actually committed a crime. I don't think that will be a popular opinion among the true crime community, but for me, there is something where prior you had to get a warrant, you had to have evidence, a reason to search. Me personally, it doesn't quite sit right with me that that's something that can be done.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think if you've listened to California True Crime before, you know we've kind of talked about this issue back and forth. And I know off when we're not recording, the three of us have had numerous discussions about this topic. And so I find myself firmly planted in the middle of the fence because as you said, Jess, I do agree with the power of using DNA, especially familiar DNA, to help bring closure to some of these cold cases. And we've seen it used for the betterment of the justice system numerous times. I mean, you know, Golden State Killer is a prime example of that. But I do find the idea of compelling the samples, especially as you said, Sean, when the person was arrested. They're not convicted. There's not a warrant. I feel the rules are somewhat hard, are a little bit loose when it comes to collecting this DNA. And that's my worry, is that there's not an ethical argument, or there's not an ethical discussion about how this stuff is done. It's just, look at the proof. We're catching bad guys, so let's keep doing it, instead of, yeah, this can be a powerful tool, but it could also potentially lead to some, you know, false arrests, or, you know, now with what people are learning about the changes in DNA technology, I would like if there was a more open and ethical discussion between experts and on how it's being used.
I totally understand what both of you guys are saying, and I feel the same way. It's hard to think about where it's suspicion, because, you know, the whole basis is innocent until proven guilty. And and until when you're arrested for a so-called felony, and who knows what brought that to happen, and then they are able to just take your DNA and keep it. It just nothing sits right. And I totally understand we've had all these closures and cases closed, but something just doesn't feel right when it is right. And it's really hard to think about. And yes, I think out of all the topics, doing this podcast for years with you guys, I think there's probably over at least a whole week of us yelling at each other about this topic, just like
Oh, yeah.
discussing it over and over again. Because, it's just something that it just keeps coming up.
Well, and I like what you said, Sean, about the idea of it being a hard when it's successful. It's a lot easier to argue against something when it's obviously wrong, illegal search and seizure or stop and frisk or things like that, where, yeah, on the surface, it's bad. Everybody can argue, like it's a miscarriage of justice or it's wrongfully putting people in prison. The problem is when something like this, that so often it's like they are closing cases. So on the surface, it's successful and it's positive, but is it legal and moral and correct? That's a harder question to have. I think that's where I stand. Is I would like more people to be open to have that ethical argument and discussion.
So after they link the relative of Martinez, they track down an old girlfriend of Martinez, and I guess for some interesting reason, she still had an old razor of his after 4 years, and they were able to match his DNA from the razor.
Why on earth would you keep a razor for 4 years?
I'm not sure if what if she's like, not to be rude, but like hoarder style and just never cleaned? So It was just there. Maybe it was like she had her own medicine cabinet or drawer that she just never cared about.
Oh, and just threw it in a pile and everything.
I mean, or she could be strange and kept it as like for some strange reason. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, she could have just put all his stuff like in a box and put it up somewhere and not thought about it after they broke up.
Yeah, I guess 4 years.
So going back to all the similarities that we talked about and everything, it was interesting that the police were so set that, like one article, how Patricia must have known her killer because there was no forced entry or anything like that. They found that there was no connection between the three. Martinez didn't know Jane or Patricia beforehand. Jane didn't know Patricia. The coincidences of Jane's brother working and knowing both, it was just all there, but it was similarities, and like we talked about, small town and stuff, so it just happened to be that it was the same killer.
Just a string of unfortunate circumstances,
right.
Coincidences.
And I know we don't know the person's name, but just because it bugs me when the police mention someone and then it turns out it's not them and they never say anything about it. The person you mentioned earlier that they brought in who was older and he had children.
Yeah, the 30-year-old, no, it wasn't him. But they did talk in that article later how there was one suspect that they couldn't clear, and they never came back to say if that was Martinez or not.
But that's two different people, right?
Correct.
Okay.
I did want to end this with, I had a very disturbing feeling, I guess. It happened when I was getting research for this case. While doing the research, a lot of the main articles of Jane and Patricia's murders were like front page of the Tribune. I kind of did the research the same way that I have it set up where I'm jumping around in the timeline. So I was researching the rape and murder of Jane in the newspaper article and didn't do any research for hours later about actual Arthur Martinez. When I was researching Martinez, an article popped up of his marriage announcement. And I was looking and going, wow, this marriage date was only weeks before he murdered Jane, like I had already mentioned. But then I was looking at the date of the paper that this announcement was in, and I'm like, this seems like a date I've already seen. This marriage announcement was on page A3 of the Tribune on November 21st, 1977. And on A1, just turning back one page, was the article, Slain Victim Hard to Trace, all about Jane's murder that only happened 4 days before. And when I turned back to A1, I just got this gross feeling that how Martinez probably did the same thing. He sees his wedding announcement, or it does it the other way around. He sees this article of a woman he murdered, and there's nowhere closer to catching him, which doesn't happen for 40 years after he dies. But if he opens the paper just one page, there's his wedding announcement to another woman only weeks before. And it was just really gross to me when I saw that. For tonight's cold case, Charles will be reading.
The Crime Stoppers program of San Luis Obispo County has announced a $5,000 reward for information leading to the identification and arrest and conviction of person or persons involved in the murder of 71-year-old Templeton resident Jerry Lee Greer. Greer was killed in his home on or about March 28, 2009. Relatives had gone to the Greer home in the 2400 block of Santa Rita Creek Road. After the victim failed to appear at a luncheon appointment, Greer was found shot to death inside his residence. If anyone has information on the suspect or suspects, they are urged to call the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office at area code 805-781-4550, or remain anonymous by calling Crime Stoppers at area code 805-549-STOP. That's 549-7867. You can also submit your tip through this website that we'll have on our website at californiatruecrime.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode of California True Crime on the Darkcast Network. For a full list of our sources, as well as more information on the case, head over to our webpage at californiatruecrime.com, where you can support the show by joining our Patreon, which has the option of ad-free episodes. Our web store is up and running with some new California True Crime merchandise. If you'd like to contact us, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Cali True Crime. Make sure that you are subscribed to our show to get our latest episodes. Leave us a 5-star review or tell a friend to get the word out about California True Crime. We'd like to thank our quality control engineer, Melanie Duncan. This was recorded at Snail Ranch Studios and The Hanger. This has been a production of JCS Inc.